Good afternoon to the audience and Professor Freİ. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let me introduce Professor Freİ. There is a lot to say. He is a German historian. He holds the chair of modern and contemporary history at the Friedrich-Schiller-Universität of Jena and heads the Jena Center History of the 20th Century. He has been working for many years on coming to terms with National Socialism in Germany. For example, he was a member of the Independent Commission of Historians, which thoroughly investigated the history of the Foreign Office under National Socialism and how this past was dealt with after 1945. Professor Freİ has held visiting professorships at Hebrew University, Jerusalem, and Stanford University, among others. His most recent publications are At the Right Time, Against the Return of Nationalism, and A History of Jews in Germany since 1945, Politics, Culture, and Society. Tonight he is here with us to share his reflections on the planned Museum of World War II and Nazi occupation policy as a place of learning, commemoration, and remembrance in Germany. I'm sure you will enjoy it. After this, we will open the floor to the audience for questions and comments. I now give the floor to Professor Freİ.
Thank you, Dr. Kramer. Thank you for the invitation again. I'm really pleased to be part of this seminar, which by coincidence or not, starts on the 150th anniversary of the first German unification. Or to be more precise, it starts exactly 150 years after the Prussian king, Wilhelm I, was pronounced the German emperor in Versailles, and this was already part of the problem, this pronunciation in Versailles. As you might have noticed, there is now another public debate in Germany about the long, dark lines from the German Kaiserreich to the failing republic, and from there to the Third Reich and to Germany's responsibility for World War II. So in a way, your seminar fits into a vivid discussion, although I don't think the debate about the Kaiserreich we are carrying now on, that this debate will result in a new German Historikerstreit, like the one we had in the mid-1980s about the singularity of the Holocaust. As announced in your program, I would like to speak briefly, and I emphasize briefly, about the situation in today's Germany regarding the memory of the German occupation policy in World War II. And I should like to emphasize that in doing so, I'm speaking just for myself, not for the German Bundestag or as a spokesperson for any political faction. I speak to you as a historian at the University of Jena who occasionally takes a public stand in historical and or commemorative issues. As you all know, the topic has gained new importance over the past 2 years. As was and as is so often the case in the Federal Republic's history of dealing with the Nazi past, the recent discussion about how to commemorate World War II was not started by politicians, but rather from within our society. I don't particularly like the term civil society, Zivilgesellschaft, but here it seems to be appropriate to make clear when we are now discussing how the Second World War should be commemorated, then this must be understood first and foremost as an initiative from below, not as a top-down process. I do not consider this as a weakness, but rather as a strength, because all historical political initiatives if they are to have an effect and a meaning, require societal participation. And this is a very important point to me, that we cannot leave this just to the politicians. It has to be supported, it has to be carried on by the society. Specifically, in the run-up to the 80th anniversary of the German attack on Poland, there was a societal initiative for a public symbol of commemoration. Of course, this initiative then lobbied within the political arena, and it took off in 2019 when more than 200 members of the German Bundestag, including its president Wolfgang Schäuble, expressed their support. The idea was, and still is, to establish a memorial in remembrance of the Polish victims of the German warfare at the Anhalter Bahnhof in Berlin. The suggested place of this memorial is the Afghanischer Platz, directly opposite the Deutschland House, which one day will house the long contested documentation center for flight and expulsion. Maybe some of you remember this bitter fight between the supporters and those who were opposing this, what they called a self-centered perspective on the expulsion of the Germans after the Second World War. Now, in September 2019, I wrote about the idea of this memorial at the Afghanischer Platz in my monthly column in the Süddeutsche Zeitung. And now I have to apologize for some kind of self-quotation. What I wrote in September 2019 was, the location is not badly chosen, but the question remains whether a monument can transform complex historical knowledge into social awareness and whether it helps in current disputes. The question remains what a brief inscription can do, which, according to the initiator's proposal, commemorates the, quote, victims of the German occupation of Poland 1939 to 1945, and honors the heroines and the heroes, this is the quotation again, the heroines and the heroes of the Polish resistance. An inscription which, apart from that, appeals to the future, stating, for a common Europe. And with regard to this brief inscription, my article concludes with the following. In Germany, unlike in Poland, there is no museum of the Second World War. There's no place that provides comprehensive information about the German occupation in Europe. There would be space for it at the ruins of the Anhalter Bahnhof. Without giving in to the pitfalls of nationalizing remembrance and the obvious questions which then will follow, namely, why not a monument for all the others, there would be space to document all the suffering and injustice that in 1939 only began with the attack on our Polish neighbors. So this was the article of September 2019, and it reflected the situation then, 80 years after the German attack on Poland and the beginning of the European War. We are now a step further, almost unnoticed by the public, one has to say. The German Bundestag in October last year came up with two important historical political decisions. On October 9, all parliamentary factions, with the exception of the populist right, of course, all the others agreed to a motion by the governing parties. The awkward title of the motion wants to be understood as a clear program, I quote, strengthen the memory of the victims of the German war of extermination and recognize groups of victims of National Socialism that have so far been neglected. This was the title of this motion. 3 weeks later, the parliament, this time with abstention from the right, gathered behind a motion that had been negotiated by representatives of the different factions without the AfD, of course, for over a year. And again, I just quote the title of this motion: to do justice to the character of German-Polish history with a place of remembrance and encounter, and to deepen the special bilateral relations. Now, despite the vagueness of the title of the second motion, both Bundestag initiatives are about bringing to light the German crimes during the Second World War and the German occupation in Europe. How much remains to be done on these topics becomes quite clear if one looks at the discrepancy between the scholarly achievements of an international community of historians, which made important progress since the early 1990s, and how much, or better, how little of their results have reached the general public. Given the dwindling contemporaneity of these historical events, now even children of World War II are great-grandmothers and great-grandfathers. Given the dwindling contemporaneity, we are now less and less dealing with memory in a literal sense. In the best case, it is now about reassuring historical knowledge, about Vergegenwärtigung. Much more often, however, it is about creating spaces and possibilities for the acquisition of such knowledge. For all those reasons, I would argue, a place of remembrance, as it was called for in the Bundestag, is not enough. What is necessary is a place for historical learning and understanding. What we need in Germany is what was already understood by a historical museum in times of emphatic enlightenment. Not a place for an old-fashioned presentation of collections and objects, which is the normal idea of a museum, but a place for education that presents critical information and relevant arguments, because only such a place is able to properly address its visitors, regardless of their age and their origin, and to strengthen what should be strengthened, namely their power of historical judgment. The broad consensus on remembrance that after hard struggles has developed in the democratic spectrum of German politics since, let's say, the 1990s, is an important achievement. The two Bundestags debates of October last year, as well as quite some speeches by our federal president Frank-Walter Steinmeier, demonstrate that the German political class is well aware of what is at stake. Obviously also because for a couple of years now, the culture of remembrance is being called into question by the right. I mean, you probably are all aware about this infamous word by one of the AfD leaders calling for a turnaround of 180 degrees with regard to the German commemoration culture in Ostpolitik. But if you listen more closely to the supporters of the Bundestag motion, something else could be heard. In addition to all honest belief in the necessity of self-confrontation with the past, there was unfortunately a pinch of too much pride in what has been achieved up to now. In addition to a portion of routine, unfortunately, there was also a portion of intellectual idleness, I would say. After all, how else should it be called when the Bundestag motion asks for establishing parallel to a place of remembrance for the Polish victims, a center that documents the horrors of the German war of annihilation throughout Europe? I mean, it should be somehow paralyzed, and nobody knows yet how this paralyzation would work. A center that should also do justice for forgotten group of victims is asked for, which would be primarily German groups of victims who until now seem to be not well enough be represented in the Berlin memorial landscape. So these two motions bring things together which are really hard to put together into a convincing concept. And my probably most important point is, how can one explain to, for instance, the people in the Ukraine why the victims of their ancestors as forced laborers in Germany or as soldiers in the Red Army count less than the suffering of the Poles? How do you want to convey to the young generation in Belarus, when the fight for democracy there is hopefully won at some point, that the crimes of the Wehrmacht in their country deserve less attention than those in other parts of the supposedly German Lebensraum in the East? Certainly, there were important differences in the German occupation policy in Europe, but nobody can seriously claim that it was shaped by prudence and consideration. The Nazi crimes in France, especially the Oradour and Ask massacres, were relatively soon also presented in the Federal Republic in the context of integration to the West. But it took decades for the Germans to confront the atrocities of the Wehrmacht and SS in Greece, or during the German retreat in northern Italy, for example. This is now where my plea, or this is the point where my plea comes in. The brutal logic of German warfare and occupation policy in Europe can only be adequately understood as a whole. To split up their representation for reasons of contemporary politics, let's say the Polish-German relations, is the wrong way to go. Instead of parallel new structures, a full-fledged history museum of the Second World War is what we need in Germany. Of course, such a new museum can happen only with the collaboration of colleagues from the countries that fell victim to the Nazi occupation policy. When such a modern museum, such a modern house of education comes into being, the German war against the Soviet Union, the German occupation policy as a whole in the East, including the Generalplan for the East, will be a central topic. And this is what I think should also be in the interest of promoting the difficult dialogue between Russia, its Western neighbors, and Germany. Thank you for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Freī, for presenting this interesting presentation and for sharing this time with us. I would like to give the audience the opportunity to ask questions, and you can do it in the chat, like you mentioned before, and also when you raise your hands. Is there someone who would like to begin? Let's wait a little bit. So still I don't see any questions and comments.
May I ask a question? It is, I think, more broad than your presentation, and but this is also about the experience of establishing the new museums, because in compare with the post-Soviet space, we see how different museums in Germany would compare again with, I don't know, those we have in Belarus or Russia or so on. Yeah, so it is kind of a glorification of the experience of the war. And my question is, so I do think that maybe you know better that the discussions from below, these grassroots initiatives, were also very important to understand or to bring new ideas, new views on the discussions about the memory of the war and victims of the war, also in the post-Soviet space, not only in Germany. But at the same time, we also may observe how effectively, I would say, the politicians can block these discussions, these grassroots initiatives. I'm sorry. Yeah. So my question is, how do you think the German experience can be important for the post-Soviet space, and what can we have from this German experience to change the views, to change the things, yeah, to influence on the society, to bring into the public these discussions on very painful topics?
Well, this is an excellent question, and right to the topic of what I know about museums on the Second World War in the formerly Soviet sphere. I mean, I visited a couple of them, and I agree with you that quite often there is this rather patriotic, glorifying mood prevalent in many of these places, and of course now in a different way than during the Soviet Union, the time of the Soviet Union, but still, I mean, the narrative normally is a national narrative, and this is also, I think, the challenge for such a museum in Germany. And if you look at what our Polish colleagues did in Danzig a couple of years ago, what they started and how contested this now is by the right-wing Polish government at the moment, and how many problems these colleagues had there, and some of them had to go, then you know that a museum, projects like this, the German one as well as others, are always part of a political discussion. Nothing can be taken for granted for all time. I mean, and this would be the idea of such a museum, especially when we have such a strong political movement towards it. It would be a very good chance, in my view, to invite Europe to take part in this project, not to explain it just from the side of the perpetrators, but to hear the nations who suffered, and to collect their perspectives, and to try. I mean, I'm really serious about thinking that such a centers, that such a museum could be a first attempt of trying to develop a European narrative on this Second World War, on the experience of the Second World War, on the societal experiences. I mean, this is not about confusing questions of guilt and responsibility, but I mean, these generations which are now the potential audience of these museums are probably more interested in knowledge about the experience of their grandfathers and their ancestors than in questions of who can still be held responsible for an historical event, which obviously we all are not responsible for anymore. Yeah, so I would take this as a chance, and maybe it inspires also social and grassroots movements in Eastern European countries, but also maybe in France or in Greece, to take part in such an endeavor. Yeah, I mean, one could think of a lot of creative ideas of communities of historians and also political activists who formulate a certain perspective from the side of their country, which should be integrated in such a museum in Berlin. I mean, it's just, or let it put me in one different way. I mean, when there was a discussion in the 90s about the Holocaust memorial in Berlin, the monument for the European Jewry, there were a couple of people who were to some extent opposed to the idea to build this monument, and who argued more important than the monument is the discussion about the thing, the discussion about the murder of the European Jewry. So the societal discussion should be taken as the memorial. I didn't buy that the argument at that point, but one part of this argument could be very attractive for a process of building this museum in Berlin. Namely, that there should be a real and in-depth and long discussion process. It should not be erected and somehow filled, but it should be a process with our neighbors in Europe.
Thank you very much, Professor Freİ. Well, I think we are used to have these long discussions, long processes, also when there were founded other memorials, for instance, for the Jewish victims in the center of Berlin. That was a long, long discussion before it was erected in the end. I mentioned, or would like to mention, the point of victim competition. I think we can use this word. There are a lot of different groups of victims, and as you said already, maybe all of them or a lot of them would like to also see themselves or their group in this memorial site. And there is the danger is maybe the risk of this victim competition. I think it's a very painful discussion and a very painful process. I, for instance, focused on research on Chechens and Russian Germans who were deported, and it was the consequence of the Third Reich, or the nationalism, National Socialism, excuse me. And still in Germany, for instance, almost nobody knows about this deportation of Chechens, yeah, that they were deported by Stalin, but the consequence of the Germans who occupied a part of the Caucasus, and also Germans who were deported 3 years earlier. So yeah, I wonder if these groups are also will be part of this process, take part of this process in founding this memorial site at Anhalter Bahnhof. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if it would be more than a memorial site, if it would be a place for documenting, critically documenting the events of the Second World War, then I have no doubt that all these perspectives can be incorporated. But what in my mind makes no sense to add one just tombstone next to the other, which is meaningless to most of the young people today. And if you don't know the story, just the story you just mentioned, then you cannot understand such a tombstone or something. Yeah. So I think we really need more than what was originally the idea of those who were in favor of this memorial site for the Polish victims of the Germans. And this is not to start a competition between the different nations. But just the opposite. We have to prevent that such a competition starts. The other day I read a news clipping about a statement of the, I think it was the ambassador of Belarus, who opposed the idea of this Polish, this document for the Polish in Berlin, saying basically what can be expected. I mean, what about us, and what about the Ukrainians and all the others? I mean, this is why I argue we should incorporate this initiative, which was understandably an initiative, a societal initiative in advance of the commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the beginning of the attack against Poland. But now we are beyond this point, and there is obviously the political will in Berlin to give the money for a full-fledged museum, and then it should be taken as a important chance to really open it up for the creation of a museum which does not compartmentalize, but brings together the experiences of occupation all over Europe. And obviously these were quite different, and in some respect also not that different experiences. Yeah, I mean, there are still within German society notions that the German occupation in the West and in the North was actually okay. I mean, just what the Germans did in Eastern Europe was bad. No, I mean, it was just the opposite. This German warfare from the first day on was based on the premise that the German army would be nourished from the occupied countries. And this is one part of the suffering of these countries. The other part is the fact that the German war industry couldn't go along without all the forced laborers. And they came not only from the East, they also came from France, from Italy later on, and so on. Yeah. So it's a truly European experience. And this European experience should be documented and understood.
Mm. We have one question before we come to this question in the chat. I would like to ask you, who is already part of this memorial or this what's the name? This center of the Planned Museum of World War II. Or which kind of institutions, which countries, or which NGOs, or whatever?
I don't think that the process has already started. This was just, if you will, a motion of the Bundestag towards the government that is saying that all factions of the Bundestag except the AfD are in favor of this. And now I think it's the Minister for Culture, Frau Grütters, who is in charge of starting this process. So it's very early, and it's an ideal chance for groups like yours to bring their interest into to the knowledge of those who are starting the process. And as far as I recall, there was first an idea that the board of the memorial for the murdered Jews should be should have the lead to start the process, but this seems to have been removed or changed again, and I'm not quite clear who now will be in charge for the first stages of the process. It's still
yeah, the first step is done, but we are waiting now and can of course participate. That's a great chance. Yeah. Okay, we have a question here in I don't know, do you see this from Ruslan Baramidze? Do you see this in the chat?
No, I only see the, well,
there are two already.
Meisner, I see here. The German Historical Museum will be in charge. Oh yeah, that's right. He is quite right. There was the switch from the memorial, the board of the Memorial Museum, the Memorial of the European Jewry, to the German Historical Museum. Yeah, but obviously the German Historical Museum in Berlin will not be the motor or the key player. They are, so this is at least what I understand, they will be in organizational terms the institution who starts the process. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a question of
oh yeah.
do you see this from Ruslan Baram? Yeah, okay, then maybe take this first.
Thanks for the interesting angle. For Georgia, understanding and presenting history and memory in a museum is a very multitasking topic. The national narrative intersects with Stalin's ethnicity about Soviet emotion in Stalin's museum, with the rejection of the Soviet narrative promoted by pro-Western politicians and the demolition of museums, with attention to Georgian military units within the German army, of course, more patriotic vision and academic discourse, and small attempts to understand all this somehow. This is a result of simultaneous processes. Do I understand correctly that discussions and commissions on these topics sometimes confuse questions even more than help to understand something? What can we do? I suspect to some extent you are right. Yes, sometimes commissions do confuse things, but I don't think that there is much of an alternative than to have these commissions with hopefully different voices, with hopefully different perspectives within these commissions. and yeah, to hope that the critical, in a good sense, critical perspectives at the end prevail. But yeah, I mean, this is what makes historical debates so interesting, and this is why I started with the new debate about the German Kaiserreich and the long lines from there. I mean, take this as an example that 30 years or so nobody cared about the birth of the Kaiserreich, that the then President of the Federal Republic, Gustav Heinemann, at the 100th anniversary, that is 50 years ago, simply said, no, I have no time and interest to commemorate this. This was possible 50 years ago for a rather self-centered, even a social democrat who abhorred the Kaiserreich and had a clear vision of how the socialists were persecuted then. And he simply said, no, I don't do any commemoration here. Nowadays, no politician could just pass by such an important day in the calendar, 150 years. But I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I would say what our federal President Steinmeier said a couple of days ago, and what he debated with a couple of younger historians, was quite interesting. It was differentiated, it was critical. And so, I mean, these processes never can be shut off or closed down. This is what we have to understand, and this is why we shouldn't be afraid of commissions.
Well, we have one more question in the chat from Sevil Huseinova.
From the article of historian Andreas Wirsching and Federal Foreign Minister Heiko Maas on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, Germany alone is responsible for the war and its casualties. On the one hand, I welcome this position, but on the other hand, there are some concerns. It looks like an attempt to monopolize blame and the responsibility for the war crimes. We were just talking before you about the significant role played by collaborators and bystanders in the Holocaust in Poland and the Ukraine. Don't you think that Germany's position can play into the hands of those in Poland and the Ukraine who refuse to discuss the Holocaust and their share of the blame for it?
Well, one more very interesting question.
Yeah, if it would be that clear that Maas and Wirsching, whom I really have a high regard for, if they would have put it that simple, then I would say yes, that would be a danger. I haven't yet looked it up, what the interview actually, or I read it a couple of weeks ago, but there might, I mean, there is a certain danger that the simplification in the political arena can be understood as what you call here the monopolization of blame. This is certainly something we have to be careful not to do. On the other hand, I can probably interpret Maas in this situation as someone who argues against the new national right in Germany, who tends to blur responsibility. So it's always a complicated field, but as a historian, of course, I would say, yes, indeed, we have to work together with our colleagues who are doing Holocaust research and to make clear that indeed the Holocaust was, starting from Germany, a European enterprise. Yes, this is something we have to say, unfortunately, but also this is something which is said and found out more and more in empirical historical research. And just a couple of years ago, I was part of a conference in the Netherlands about the bystanders and the perpetrators. I mean, this concept of Raoul Hilberg, victims, bystanders, perpetrators, and it became quite clear how efficient vast parts, for instance, of the Dutch society took part in the deportation programs, and finally, in that respect, to the Holocaust. So this is, I perfectly agree that in the scholarly research, we are far ahead of what is sometimes concluded in the political arena. Mm. And then we are, as historians, are urged to make up our minds. Yeah.
Yeah. So I see our participants have woken up. There are more questions. There is one of Katharina Kraft in the F&A. Yeah.
Thank you a lot. Is the Second World War only in a European experience? The idea of the museum is quite Europe-centric, which is not wrong, but we mustn't forget all the other victims worldwide in this discourse. If we would plan a museum on the Second World War in the full meaning, then I perfectly agree. And I definitely don't think that we can ignore the other places of the Second World War, the other, the fact that it was a global war. But on the other hand, you can solve these problems by saying, well, this is our main focus, but there are also places and rooms and occasions where you could integrate the worldwide experience. And by the way, parts of the important parts of the European war actually were carried out in the Middle East. Yeah, there will be a new book by Dandina in a couple of weeks, I suspect, and he makes it quite clear how important the Middle East scenario was for the final victory over Nazi Germany. So yes, I mean, you can't exclusively focus on Europe, but I think it would be legitimate to have the main emphasis, if you have such a museum in Berlin and not in Tokyo, you would have the main emphasis not on the Pacific War, but on the European War.
Yes, there are still more questions now from Julia Machnowska.
That I don't see. I have here. Yeah, that is what I have.
Yeah, then let's take this.
Thank you for an interesting presentation. I have two questions. First, I was wondering about the relation to planned museum planned museum with other places in Berlin related to World War II, Topography of Terror, right? Or the German Resistance Memorial Center, Forced Labor Documentation Center. How is it going to influence Berlin Memory Map? Is there going to be some sort of dialogue between those institutions? Let me answer to the first question. I mean, I'm as I tried to make clear, it's in the very beginning, and these are the important questions which have to be addressed. I mean, the topography des terrors, the topography of terror is an important museum, well received by the public, and of course there has to be a dialogue, and it has to be reflected about how one can integrate the new and more total approach of this Second World War Museum, if it comes to it, into the memorial landscape of Berlin. The second part of the question was about the problem with Gdansk. When thinking about War Museum in Berlin, do you have an idea how to protect such institutions from the politicization, from politics who want to influence its narrative? Is it possible to set up some kind of mechanism that will help accomplish it? Well, yes, the most important mechanism is a vivid civil society that is aware of what is going on. And I mean, this is why I emphasize so much the fact that there must be a initiative from below, from the grassroots. This was the case with the Topographie des Terrors. It was a perfectly citizen initiative in Berlin. And despite the fact that all these initiatives finally need state money in order to build these things, they also always need public and civil support and civil initiative. I mean, in order to make it a lively museum, in an accepted museum, you need these local initiatives or nationwide initiatives, and you need a board which is independent from the state. You need ideas which in the German media system are well known by the so-called public broadcasting corporations. I mean, the öffentlich-rechtliche organization, public, I don't know actually, it's an equivalent to National Public Radio in the US. Despite the fact that the role of National Public Radio in the US is diminishing, we still have these important relics actually of the Allied media policy in post-war Germany. And this is an idea which can be carried on to museums, to have on the respective boards always also representatives of the different pluralistic groups within the society and not just politicians.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's are the questions now. Are there any more questions in the audience or comments? Yeah, there is. Svetlana Baltovska. She asked a question about the museum Berlin-Karlshorst.
Is it very reasonable to create something new instead develop an institution that already exists successful? This is a very good point, because this is also something which one can see critically about this German commemoration politics. I mean, it is true that every new government wants to do something new, to create things instead of taking care that existing things are kept well. And yes, there might be a risk for the museum in Berlin, Karlshorst, that it might get into the shadow of something more prominently and more well sponsored. But these are also questions, and important questions, which have to be discussed when there is a first expert board for such a new initiative, because it cannot be the case that this Karlshorst museum would be put aside just because of something new. I mean, normally one finds that despite the fact that there are so many sites and museums already around, we also can see that there is still room for more, and that we need to then, if the money is finally put on the table for such a initiative as the Bundestag voted for, that one defines clearly what is the special topic and the additional perspective of such an endeavor. But I mean, yes, Topographie des Terrors, Berlin, Karlshorst, and many other things are already around, and this has to be taken into consideration, no doubt about that.
Thank you a lot, Professor Freİ. I don't see any more questions now. It's the last chance to raise the hand or to write something in the chat to the audience. Yeah, if there is no any questions more, then I would like to thank Professor Freİ for this interesting discussion, for this interesting presentation. Maybe in 10 years, when we have the 85th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, we will visit this museum, this planned museum. Maybe then we have it already in Berlin at the Anhalter Bahnhof. We will see. It takes a long time, as we know from other memorials and museums. So we are optimistic, and I think I can speak for everybody. We hope that a lot of initiatives, people, civil society will take part in this discussion, in this process. And maybe, or the hope is that Europe comes more together, all the different points of views which we have there, and also the debates and painful discussions, maybe they will come a step forward. Yeah. So again, thank you very much for speaking with us tonight, Professor Freİ. It was a pleasure to have you here.
It's a pleasure on my side, and bye-bye.
Yeah,
I also want to say thank you very much, vielen Dank, for your significant contribution to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Auf Wiedersehen.
Auf Wiedersehen.